Hi, Tian. So we're going to finish this book today, the SOS Titanic. There's the name written on the side of the boat. So we're at 9 p.m., chapter 9. Where's the a la carte restaurant? Matt asked Mrs. Brown as soon as dinner was over. We thought it would be fun to peek into it. Good idea. Have a look before bedtime. You're probably tired. I am for sure. Mrs. Brown yawned and stood up. They bid everyone at the table good night. They returned to Mrs. Brown's stateroom and she drew them a map. She put an X on the spot where they'd find the a la carte restaurant. Good night, Mrs. Brown, said Matt, picking up the sled. Thank you for dinner and for telling Arthur to leave us alone, and for everything, said Emily. She hugged Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown hugged Emily back. She shook hands with Matt. Now remember, come see me tomorrow and we'll have dinner with the captain. Mrs. Brown shut the door to her stateroom. Emily and Matt raced to the a la carte restaurant. There was no one there except a few waiters cleaning up. Dinner's over, barked a waiter. We're looking for the captain, said Matt. He left hours ago. Oh no, said Emily. They darted out of the restaurant and back down the deck. Now what? Asked Matt. Now nothing. It's hopeless, said Emily. The ship is huge. The captain could be anywhere. We'll never find him. And it's getting cold outside. It's getting late too, groaned Matt. They turned a corner. A bearded man in a dark uniform with shiny buttons and a fancy cap was walking toward them. He looked like the captain, whispered Emily. The friends hurried over to him. Are you Captain Smith? Asked Matt. The man nodded. Yes, what can I do for you? We have to ask you something. It's a matter of life and death, and you have to believe us. Please, said Emily. Go ahead, said the captain. I'm listening. Could you slow the ship down? It's going to hit an iceberg very, very soon. Please be on the lookout. The captain smiled. Then he patted Emily on the arm. Now, my dear child, nothing will happen. Even if the reports of iceberg in the area are true, we'll have enough time to steer the ship out of the way. And if we were to hit an iceberg, this ship is rock solid. Nothing will sink it. Now off you go. You should both be in bed by now. The captain began to walk away. Matt ran after him. Wait, sir, please. If you don't slow the ship down, the Titanic will collide with an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. and sink less than 3 hours later. If you don't do something about it, I know you'll feel terrible when that happens. The captain sighed. I know you mean well, and I know you believe what you're telling me. I have a daughter, and she has a vivid imagination like you. You should be enjoying the trip, not worrying about icebergs. It's not every day that a boy and girl travel on such a wonderful ship. I assure you, you will remember this voyage forever. Emily gulped. We'll remember the Titanic. The whole world will remember what happens tonight, said Matt. The captain smiled, tipped his cap, and walked off. Chapter 10, 9:30 p.m. Emily sank into a deck chair. I give up, she said, throwing her hands up. No one believes us. This ship is going under and we can't do anything to stop it. We can stop it. We have to stop it. I believe you, called a girl. Emily and Matt looked up. It was Sally. She was racing down the deck in her nightgown. When I told my aunt about your little talking machine, she said I must have imagined it playing my voice back, said Sally. She said no child could figure out how to do a trick like that, and that machine could never work. And then I knew you are from the future. The Titanic is going to sink. When my aunt went to sleep, I tiptoed out of the cabin. I thought I'd never find you in time, but I have. It's too late. No one believes us. The captain won't slow the ship down, said Matt. There's one more person to try. Let's talk to the wireless operator. Let's tell him to send a message and get help, said Sally. I know where the wireless office is. Follow me. The three friends dashed over to the office. The wireless officer had piles of messages on his desk. He was transmitting them one by one. Please stop what you're doing, said Matt, huffing and out of breath. Send an SOS. We're going to hit an iceberg in less than 2 hours. Lots of people are going to drown unless you do something now, said Emily. It's all up to you, said Sally. The wireless officer looked up from his stacks of messages. His face was red and angry. Get out of here, he shouted. Can't you see I'm busy? I have all these messages to send. If they don't go out, I'll be in big trouble. I have no time to play silly children's games. We're not silly, said Sally. And we're not kidding, said Emily. We're going to hit the iceberg at 11:40, said Matt. There's no time left. If you three don't get out of here right now, I'm going to pick you up one by one and toss you out, said the wireless officer, waving a fist at them. Matt sighed. Okay, we're going, but at 11:40 you'll see that this is no joke. The ship is doomed unless you do something fast. But the wireless officer's only response was to shout, Get out! Get out! Get out! The three friends darted out of the office. I have to tell my aunt to wake up and get dressed, said Sally. I'd better dress in something warm too. We have to find a lifeboat. I don't want to drown. Are you going back to the future before the ship hits the iceberg? Matt and Emily glanced at the sled. There were no words in front telling them to leave. And you see, those are the words in front to remember if we go back. The words in front are always this. Rub the leaf 3 times fast, soon you'll fly to the past. Although that may be just to get to the past, there might be something else to get them back to the future. We don't know when we're leaving, said Matt. We'll come with you now. They all raced to Sally's cabin. Aunt Ellen, you must get up now. You have to get dressed. It's an emergency, cried Sally. Sally's aunt rubbed her eyes and sat up in bed. What's happened? She asked. Nothing's happened yet, but soon the ship will hit an iceberg and start to sink, said Matt. Who are these children, Sally, and why are you running around with them? You're in your nightgown. Your mother would be appalled. It's late. Get back to bed this instant. I'm not getting into bed, said Sally. I'm getting dressed, and so should you. Matt, could you step outside while I get into my clothes? Sure, said Matt. I'll wait outside with Matt, said Emily. They waited outside Sally's cabin. Matt and Emily heard Sally arguing with her aunt. Their voices were so loud that they could hear every word. But no matter what Sally said, her aunt was not convinced that anything terrible was going to happen. They've been arguing for an hour, Emily whispered to Matt. I know. It must be close to 11 p.m. There's no time left. Sally is beginning to sound desperate. How is she ever going to convince her aunt to leave her cabin? Sally sounded like she was about to cry. Please, Aunt Ellen, I'll never ask you for anything else ever again if you'll just do this one thing for me, please. This is important. It is a matter of life and death. Sally, you are impossible, said her aunt. If I go upstairs with you for a few minutes, do you promise to be good for the rest of the voyage? I'll be good as gold and you'll be glad we went. I doubt that, but I'll go up to the deck for a few minutes with you and your friends so I can get some rest. Chapter 11, 11:30 p.m. Sally opened the door. She was dressed in layers of clothes. My aunt will be right out, said Sally. She has to hurry, said Matt. The ship will hit the iceberg in 10 minutes. She promised to be out right away, said Sally. While they waited, another cabin door opened. Hilda Slater stepped out of the cabin wearing a coat over her nightgown. She yawned as she looked up and down the hall. Mrs. Slater, remember us, Emily and Matt, cried Emily. What's all the noise? Asked Hilda. The ship is headed straight for an iceberg. It's too late to stop it, said Matt. Are you sure, said Hilda. We're positive, said Emily. I don't know what to do, said Hilda. Florence is still asleep. Wake her up and get into a lifeboat, said Emily. But my dress, my jewels, how can I leave everything? How can you take anything, cried Emily. Forget about the dress. Save yourself, please. Hilda shook her head like she was trying to snap herself out of a bad dream. You're right, of course, thank you. Take care of yourselves. Hilda dashed back into her cabin. The friends could hear her call, Florence, wake up, there's an emergency. Sally's aunt popped out of their cabin. Let's head for the boat deck, said Matt. The lifeboats are there. Everyone followed Matt up the stairs into the forward part of the boat deck. As they reached the deck, they felt a jolt. Then there was silence. Why is it so quiet all of a sudden? Asked Sally. I think the engines have stopped, said Matt. Oh my goodness, said Sally. We've hit the iceberg. I hardly felt anything, said Sally's aunt. You must be mistaken. I'll ask this steward what he knows. Sally's aunt approached a young steward. The children think we've hit an iceberg. We haven't, have we? The steward gulped. Something did happen. I'm not sure what, ma'am. Maybe you'd better stay on deck till we find out more. Oh my, said Sally's aunt. Something terrible has happened. I don't know how you children knew, but people began to run up to the deck. There were parents and children, old people and young people. Some were dressed. Some were still in their night clothes with a coat slung over them. Everyone clustered around the deck. Did you hear it, said an older woman. Did you feel it? It can't be, said her husband. Not the Titanic, said a tall woman wrapped in furs. It's not possible. It is possible, said a familiar voice. It was Mrs. Brown. She hurried over to where Emily, Matt, Sally, and her aunt were huddled. You two knew something was going to happen tonight. I don't know how, but you were right. We must speak to somebody from the crew. Everyone peered around, but they couldn't see anyone from the crew. Emily and Matt looked at each other. The Titanic was going to sink fast. People had to get into the lifeboats soon. Just then an officer dashed up to the deck. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, I'm going to have to ask you to head toward the lifeboats. Women and children first. There is no cause for panic, but please move quickly. Hurry, said Mrs. Brown. There's a lifeboat here. Let's all get in. But before they could move, Emily poked Matt in the side. Look at the sled. Shimmery gold words were forming on the front of the sled. You tried your best, you let them know, but now it's time for you to go. We have to go home, said Matt. Goodbye, Sally. Goodbye, Mrs. Brown. Goodbye, everyone. Good luck, said Emily as she hopped on the sled behind Matt. The sled rose in the air. Everyone was so busy scrambling into lifeboats that few people looked up to see it flying. The only ones who did were Sally and Mrs. Brown. As the sled rose above the Titanic, Sally called out, Remember me. Mrs. Brown said, Well, I'll be. Then she stepped into lifeboat number 6. And there they are. And you see there's the Titanic and it's starting to sink. And then there's the lifeboats. Soon the sled was high over the Titanic. Below, the huge ship was leaning into the sea. It was starting to sink. Emily closed her eyes. It's so sad. There was nothing we could do to save the ship. But maybe we helped Sally, her aunt, Mrs. Brown, and Hilda. Maybe even that boy Lou remembered our warning and jumped into a lifeboat. I hope so, said Emily, as the sled burst into the fluffy white cloud. Before they knew it, they were back in Emily's tower room. The two friends slid off the sled. I can't believe it, said Emily. We were there when the iceberg hit the Titanic. I wish we could have done something to make the captain stop the ship. I know, said Emily. I wonder if our friends made it back safely. Me too. Let's look up the names of the survivors on the internet, said Emily. Emily and Matt raced downstairs and turned on Emily's computer. They Googled the words Titanic survivors. "I'm almost too nervous to look," said Emily. "I'd like some of those people we met on the Titanic. I hope they didn't drown." Matt stared at the screen. "I don't see a boy named Lou listed in third class. There's no record of him at all. Maybe Lou was his nickname." "We'll never know," said Emily sadly. "Look, Matt, it says here that Captain Smith went down with the ship, and Mr. and Mrs. Strauss decided to stay on the ship and let younger people take their place on the lifeboats. They were so kind." She sniffed back a tear. "I'll think of them whenever I go to Macy's in New York. I wish they had known that their store would still be around today." "Look," said Matt, pointing at the list. "Yahoo!" cried Emily. "There's Hilda Slater's name. And Mrs. Brown," said Matt. "And there's a Sally from second class and an Ellen from second class too. It looks like most of the first class kids survived." Emily smiled. Then she grabbed her sketchbook and drew a picture of the Titanic. Beside it, she wrote the names of all the people they met. "I'll never forget each person we got to know on the Titanic," she said. Matt nodded. "And whenever I look at my model of the Titanic, I'll remember what happened to us while we were there. That was an awesome adventure, and that was an awesome ship." So here's some more facts about, remember, each one of them, both Matt and Emily, do 10 facts about the ship. So the word Titanic means huge, gigantic, or colossal. It was as high as an 11-story apartment building, so it was very tall. 5 people on the Titanic were born in Canada. 35 lived in Canada, and 81 were on their way there. There were as many as a dozen dogs on the Titanic. The crew took them for walks every day, but only 2 dogs survived. Before the Titanic left Southampton, England, on its way to New York, it almost collided with a ship called the New York. Captain Smith took a more southerly route than usual because he had received warnings of icebergs, but he never slowed the ship down. When the iceberg hit, John Phillips, the first wireless officer, sent a SOS message by Morse code. SOS was a new signal invented to alert the receiver of the need for immediate help. Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of the wireless telegraph, was supposed to sail from New York to England on the Titanic's return trip. The Titanic had 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible boats, only enough for half of the 2,200 passengers. In 1985, Dr. Robert Ballard discovered the remains of the Titanic deep in the Atlantic. He proved the ship had broken in 2 before sinking. The last survivor of the Titanic, Melvyn Dean, died in May 2009. She was just 9 weeks old when she and her family boarded the ship as third-class passengers. She lived to almost 100. And here's Emily's top 10 facts. Some of the cargo the Titanic carried was 5 grand pianos, 12 cases of ostrich plumes, 3 cases of shelled walnuts, 25 cans of sardines, and 15 cases of rabbit hair. Neither of the lookouts in the Titanic, Frederick Fleet or Reginald Lee, had binoculars. They'd misplaced them in the rush to get on board. The Titanic was one of the few ships in those days that let kids eat with their parents in the dining room. French ships didn't even allow infants on board. Some of the world's richest people traveled on the Titanic, like Colonel and Mrs. Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim. Of those 3, Mrs. Astor was the only one to survive. Captain Smith ordered the crew to send white rockets into the air. He hoped that some ship would notice and see that the Titanic was sinking, but no ship noticed. The first Macy's parade took place in November 1924, 12 years after the Titanic sunk. Violet Jessup, a stewardess on the Titanic, survived. 4 years later, during World War I, she sailed on the Britannic. It sank too, but Violet came through again. One of the wireless operators, Harold Bride, survived the disaster. The other, Jack Phillips, did not. Some men, like Jack Thayer and Harold Bride, clung to an overturned lifeboat for hours. It's amazing that they managed to hold on until the Carpathia arrived to rescue the survivors. The Carpathia arrived in New York on April 18, 1912 at 9 p.m. with 705 Titanic survivors. So it sank off the coast of Newfoundland, which is in Canada, and the iceberg was part of a glacier from Greenland that had broken off at sea. They're very common in Newfoundland. We were in Newfoundland, and we were in a boat that took us out to see some of the icebergs. They didn't see the iceberg because it could have been a bluebird. An iceberg is called that when it rolls over because of strong currents. Then the newly exposed part is darker than the rest of the iceberg. That would make the iceberg difficult to see, especially since most of the iceberg is underwater. And remember, I showed you that picture of the iceberg and how much of it was underwater. SOS it's just a signal in a particular code. 3 dots, 3 dashes, and 3 dots repeated over and over again without pause in between. So the Canadian, Hilda, she was born in Halifax and the 10th child. Her wedding dress, though, was lost at sea. And Mrs. Brown, who we met, she was a strong advocate for women's rights, education, human rights, literacy, and she ran for government. She helped people get into the lifeboats, and then she boarded herself. So that's it. So we finished that book. That was it, and it was sad that tragedy happened and so many people lost their lives. The next book that we're going to read, Tian, is this one, and it's by the same author, Frida Wyszynski, and it's called A Quest in Time. So it's not one of the, because as you see, there's no sled up here, so it's not one of those, but it has different stories in it about different people from the past. So that's what we're going to read. We'll do that tomorrow. So I hope you enjoyed that. Well, I know it was sad, but it's something that did happen. So you learned a little bit about icebergs and what they are, and they can really damage a ship. You don't have any icebergs where you are. I hope you had a great day and lots of fun with your friends, and maybe did some schoolwork too. Hugs and kisses.